Okay, announcements. Anybody have an announcement? We're not going to pass the clipboards today. The sign-up sheets will be over here for the breakfast, Christmas breakfast, the Christmas party, and committees. If you'd like to serve on one or more of the committees. Yeah.
Are the recipes there?
Are the recipes there?
Supposed to have recipes for the pull apart and the egg?
Tammy's supposed to bring those to you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are taken care of. I have no recipes. Okay. Okay. All right. Any other announcements? What do you think? All right. Why don't we start? Yeah.
Patty's not here yet, but this is the absolute positive last minute that you would sign up for the party.
For the party, you got to sign up today.
Sign up and pay today.
Today. Okay. All right. Great. And the sheets will be over here. So, yeah. Also, we don't really take up or do something for emergency infant services in our Christmas season, and this year we're collecting blankets. There's one over there right now, but also donations. They can use the cash to do to buy what they really need. So I'm going to pass this envelope around. If you can have any spare cash or a check or whatever, you can put it in the envelope. And we will also pass this next week as well. So if you weren't prepared to do it today, so I'll send this around and then we'll do it again next week. John, would you start us off with prayer?
Good morning, everybody.
They can't hear you.
You got to put
They
that right.
can now.
I heard
Here's
you.
a test to see if y'all want to listen. If you would, bow your heads with me. Lord, thank you for this day, for this church, for these people. Make sure that all of our hearts are ready to hear from you today. Be with those who aren't with us today, but let them know that they're in our thoughts and our prayers. We are lucky to be here, and we are lucky to have you in our lives. Amen.
Thanks, Doc. Appreciate it. Okay. Our speaker again this week is Dr. Brandon Scott. He was here last week, as you know, and he was brave enough to come back to this group again this week. So, he really made us think last week, and today we're going to be taxed again, I think, aren't we, Brandon? 6 exciting discoveries about the first 2 centuries. So with that, I will turn it over to Brandon. Come on up.
Thanks.
You bet.
Just last week, I brought the bad news, especially if you belong to the Disciples of Christ Christian Church. There weren't any Christians in the first 2 centuries. So, and that's really true. You have to really get that through your head. You just can't use the word Christian until you get late into the 3rd century. Why? Because there's not enough organization. You don't have any established beliefs. You don't have any established practices. There's no creed. All of that comes really late in the 3rd and the 4th century. So that what we identify as Christian happens much, much later. Lots of what they do in the first 2 centuries we don't do anymore. It's really different. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. The positive side, although you might not find it positive, 6 surprising discoveries. The first one that is really kind of important to see is that one of the chief characteristics of the first 2 centuries is resistance to the empire. And that really comes from the fact that the cult lord of this group is a crucified Jewish Messiah. And you can't get away from that. Okay, if you live in the Roman Empire and your cult Lord is the crucified Messiah, you got a problem. And you got a big problem. The other thing to notice here is this is resistance, not revolution. There's no kind of evidence for Jesus being a revolutionary. He's a resistor. There's no kind of evidence for these early Jesus groups involved in revolution. They're not stupid. Okay? You don't revolt against the 10,000-pound gorilla. It just squashes you. They're good at it. They know how to do it. See? But resistance, that's a major kind of theme. And they really do resist in many, many ways. I don't want to get off the topic here, but there are a number of major studies about slavery and how slaves behaved that indicate they learned how to resist the master. So they would walk slow, or they wouldn't work all that hard. That's why slavery was never all that profitable. There's too many ways to kind of get around it, So resistance is a way of life. Okay? I love this piece. It's in the Austrian Rijksmuseum. It's called a Gemini Augustae, and it comes from the period of Augustus. It's a piece of jewelry. It's about this big. It's white onyx carved on black onyx. This is Augustus, okay? And he's in what's called his Zeus form. He's dressed like a god. Okay, I love this picture because down here, how do I make this work? Oh, here, that's Zeus as an eagle looking up adoringly to Augustus. You talk about hubris. You have to think well of yourself to do that, okay? And he's in the Zeus form. The next character down here, that's a crucified barbarian. That's what Romans think Jesus looks like. So this is a pictorial image of religion in the first 2 centuries. On top, that's Augustus. That's what a god should look like. Down below is a crucified barbarian. That's what the Jesus people says a god looks like. See? You got a real issue going on. Both groups shared a large amount of vocabulary. Augustus, almost all the emperors took the name Augustus, and what it means is the august one, the divine one. So divinity is built into the understanding of the emperor. The emperor is the Lord, Kurios, master. It's one of the empire's favorite titles. Jesus also uses Lord, but he also uses slave. So there's a kind of curious paradox in the way these early Jesus groups view Jesus both as a Lord and as a slave. You get it kind of twisted there. Augustus is the father of the empire. Patria Ecclesia. Okay. Jesus is always referred to as a son. He's not the father. So there's a clear kind of subordination going on. Both of them use the title of Savior. Augustus is viewed as the savior of the empire. And the proof of that he was a savior was he bought peace, Pax Romana, which you probably all learned about in high school, right? It was Pax Romana as long as you were Romana. Okay? But if you were Anglicae, Germanicae, or Judaicae, it was called Oppressio. Okay? It's all a point of view thing. But Jesus is also viewed as the Savior. So you get the common language. Both of them bring peace, and both of them use the word euangelion, gospel. There is a gospel of the empire. There is a good news. Caesar has saved you. See? So they both have very similar messages, but about very different things. See? What constitutes peace is very different in the empire than it is in a Jesus group. All right, gender bending. This is a big surprise, and of course, we use the title that just to get your attention. You could also talk about queering. Those are both technical terms. They both apply to what's going on in these Jesus groups in the first 2 centuries. You have to kind of think, 2 big things they think about in these Jesus groups are the kingdom of God. It's not just, pardon me, any old God, it's the God of Israel. You have to always kind of remember that. We say kingdom of God and we think it's our God. It's not. It's their God. It's the God of Israel. That's what that phrase refers to. And they talk about new creation. They view what is happening as a new creation. And they kind of mingle these 2 phrases. They really, later in the 3rd century, paradise kind of slips in, and they all 3 get mangled up in ways that are very creative but hard to sort out. And historians like to sort things out. You know, that's what we do, is sort things out. This is based on their understanding of the Genesis story. God said, let us make humankind in our image. Notice the "our." In the Hebrew Bible, God's a plural. Elohim. And it's not a singular. According to our likeness. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God did he create them. Male and female, he created them. Early Judaism, as well as early Jesus folks, understand the Genesis text to mean that God is bisexual. They don't think of no sex. There's no such thing in the ancient world as no sex. There's only 2, and therefore if God is all things, he's got to be both. So they think of him in this kind of, for us, weird way, because we're over-genderized. I'm just describing it anthropologically. Okay? Our culture makes a radical distinction between male and female. The ancient world does not. They view there's only one sex, it's male, and females are a deviant version. That's the way they think of it. So therefore, God embodies both genders, and they kind of view it kind of androgynously. That's kind of the way they view that. So therefore, Paul will say, you are no longer Jew or Greek, no longer slave or free, no longer male or female. And the reason they put that in quotes in this text is he's quoting the Septuagint, the creation story. So he's saying now that we're in a new creation, the sex thing doesn't work anymore. You are like God, and therefore in some way both genders. Okay, this has practical outcomes in early Christianity. Now, about the matters you raised. This is the Corinthians had written to Paul about now that they were experimenting with sexual roles, things weren't working out so well. They were having some problems. So he writes to try to help them sort this out. You raised in your letter, I do think it is better for a man to abstain from sexual intercourse with a woman. Paul has consistently pushes no marriage. That in itself is revolutionary. Okay, and we're going to come back to that in a second, but don't forget that. Now, don't hang up with celibacy here, folks. That's an invention from the 5th century. You know, it doesn't happen until a long time down the pike. He's not talking about celibacy. He thinks the end of the world is coming pretty soon, so why waste your time? Okay, but now listen to the text. But because of sexual immorality, he doesn't think it's among them, it's just in general around. You live in a highly sexualized world. I think because of sexual immorality is so prevalent, I think that each man should have sexual intercourse with his own wife, and each woman should have sexual intercourse with her own husband. So he thinks they should do that. He thinks if you're up to it, you don't have to, but it's okay. The husband should give his wife what he owes her, and likewise the wife should give her husband what she owes him. The wife does not have authority over her own body, her husband does. And the husband does not have authority over his body, but the wife does. Notice what he's done. He's made them co-equal. Everything he says about the man, he says about the woman. Everything he says about the woman, he says about the man. That's not the way it's supposed to be. Especially in a culture that thinks of women as somehow deviant males. The reason why they think that, of course, is male sexual parts point out and females point in. That's the argument in Greek thought and all of this thought in the ancient world for why that works that way. You might laugh at it, but it makes a certain sense given the, you know. Okay, so notice what he's saying here. See? He equalizes the two. That is, there's no distinction. He's really living up to exactly what he said, no male, no female. Okay, what's good for one is good for the other. As far as we know, Paul is the only person in the ancient world to say this. This would be considered radical in the ancient world. I mean, frankly, it'd be fairly radical in the modern world. Then this is the next phrase here. I wish that everyone were like me in this regard. You know, we all wish that everyone was like us, don't we? You know? I mean, think about it. If you're really honest with yourself, it'd be a boring world, but I mean, it'd be a lot less conflict. But we all have our own special gift. The word for gift here is charisma. Everybody has their own charism, Paul says. Some have a charism that I have, not to be married. Others have a charism to be married. So notice what he says. Yeah, I think everybody should be like me, but God has decided otherwise by giving these charisms. It's a very interesting kind of argument. See? So he acknowledges, yeah, I think God should do it this way, but actually God's done it this way. As a result of this kind of bending and melding of genders in the early Jesus groups, there's no strong push towards marriage in these groups. And this plays out in some very practical ways. First of all, the average age at which a Roman matron got married was 12 years old. And as a result, I see a lot of moans in the room. Okay? As a result, there were a lot of problems with childbirth. It's too darn early to get pregnant. Jesus group women tend to get married more in the late 20s. And as a result, they're healthier. Okay? Roman women cannot inherit property. Jesus group women can inherit their property. That's why you end up with a lot of women being patrons of these house communities, being the heads of them, because they got the dough. Okay. This, by the way, this whole problem played out up until the 20th century. I'm an Emily Dickinson nut. Have loved Emily Dickinson for as long as I can remember. I love her poetry. I got through my wife's breast cancer treatment by exegeting an Emily Dickinson poem a day. That's how I did it. Emily Dickinson did not get married because her father didn't want to see her die. He was a rich man, and he didn't need for her to get married. So he had 2 daughters and a son. The son got married and had children. Neither the daughter married. He was more than willing to support them. See? That's what's playing out in the Roman Empire. You get these women married when they're 12, 13, they start dying off. You get lots of problems. Okay? As a result, Augustus published what's called the Lex Julia. He had a population problem. Okay? Lots of slaves, not enough upper class people. And so he passed laws that required people to get married. If your wife died, you had 3 months to remarry or you got taxed. You think the Democrats are bad. Listen, folks. I got a whole list here that would really make your life worse. Okay? So he passed all these kind of laws to encourage marriage and fertility. It didn't really work, but most laws we're going to find out real soon when we do away with Roe v. Wade, it's not going to make much difference. It's just going to cause a lot of shit. People do what they want to do, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to be political, but actually I am. So this is a very typical statue celebrating a Roman marriage. And the man is clearly in the dominant position. The woman is in the subordinate position. And then there's these two people. There's no such thing in the ancient world as a nuclear family. You always got people around you. You've always got lots of people. It always involves a larger group. There's none of this husband and wife thing. That's a modern invention. Actually, it's an invention of the 1950s. Okay. It is common. Now, all this stuff didn't work. Paul had problems with some of this. Some of it went too darn far. Okay, It's common knowledge, I hear, that there is an immoral sexual behavior among you of a kind that is inadmissible even among pagans. Paul can think of no higher insult than calling them pagans. Okay? That one of you has a sexual relationship with his father's wife, and you are proud of it. See, because why would he be proud? Why would a person be proud of it? Because they're demonstrating that they've been freed from these sexual bonds. Okay? Should you not rather be so aggrieved that you would expel one who has done this from your company? So he's found a line. We're not going to do this. See, we're not going this far. So when you start bending gender and experimenting with it, you then have to find where the new standards are. And you can see this going on in various groups. This is another example. This is the Acts of Paul and Thecla. I'm going to take from this. I actually really like this little piece. It's written somewhere around 150, which means we have no idea when it was written, just somewhere in the 2nd century. Okay? You use chirca to cover a multitude of sins. Okay? But it's roughly in that area. It's what's called a Romanic tale, which are rather common in that we have a number of these things from the ancient world. This one became very popular among Christians well up into the 12th century. And it exists in both Latin and Greek manuscripts, and Thecla is a character. It's called the Acts of Paul and Thecla, and Paul's a minor character. She's the major character. The thing is really all about her. Erin Bacumbre, who was one of the co-authors of this book, she always wants to call it the Acts of Thecla. But the reason it tells you it's Paul and Thecla, it's not the male thing. It tells you what tradition it belongs to. It belongs to the Pauline tradition. This is a Pauline story within that group that's going on. The story accentuates from the very beginning that she's a daughter. You get a description of her father, her family tree, the whole thing. She's an upper-class Roman, and she's supposed to be a faithful daughter. She's engaged to an upper-class Roman. He's a kind of a junior magistrate. And she hears Paul preaching and immediately follows him, but her family is in opposition. And it's a fresco. It's in a cave in Ephesus, it was discovered about 8 years ago. It was in a 12th century chapel, and the chapel had been damaged with water because it's in a cave and everything, and they were going to restore it. And when they went to restore it, they found this 4th century, that's in the 300s. We don't get stuff. People in we get really excited when you hear that. Okay, so here's Thecla in her house, and here's Paul preaching to her, and here's her mother forbidding her to do it. See, and it's a kind of frescoes that makes up the story, So you have to know the story to kind of understand what it is. But it's a beautiful piece. So her family is in opposition. She refuses to get married, and the fiancé demands his rights that he should marry. And so he brings her before the magistrate. This is, by the way, right out of a Shakespeare play. You know, you all know this play. Okay, Midsummer Night's Dream. This is the plot of, this is a well-established plot. Shakespeare didn't make it up. It's been around for a long time. And she refuses. And so she has to choose between marriage and death. And this is one of 3 occasions in the story where she's put to death, but it doesn't work. The magistrate sentences her to die with the lions. Okay, and here we have, this is a 9th century piece, and you can see she's surrounded by the lions. The lions just play with her. They lay down and, you know, she pets them and everything. They won't eat her. So that whole thing collapses. 3 different times they attempt to do it, to attempt to put her to death. One, all the women in the auditorium throw their perfume up in the air, and so the wild animals start crying and can't. And then in another time, they try to drown her to death, and the dolphins come in and grab her and carry her off away. So, and you find statues all around celebrating these kinds, because this was a very popular story. The reason why it's popular is martyrdom, as we saw last week, is very important among these groups. But some people don't want to be martyred. So it becomes an issue. You know, do you seek martyrdom or what? I mean, that's a very big debate issue among these groups. And Thecla is an example of somebody who doesn't seek martyr, but it was attempted to be martyred 3 times, and it doesn't work. So she appeals to both groups. Her story appeals to everyone. You can interpret that story any way you want to. Oh, you should seek martyrdom, and you won't, or you don't have to. I mean, it works. Okay? So it's one of her 3 rescues. And she forms a new family with an adopted mother and sisters. So she forms an all-female group who are not married, and one of whom is the mother, apparently the kind of what we would call the head of the group. Okay? She dresses like a man. That's emphasized over and over again in the story. And she cuts her hair. Okay? And she preaches the gospel. Here, this is a modern Greek Orthodox image of Thecla, and they are showing her as an apostle. Notice she's got the cross in the book with the finger out. That's the apostolic sign. So she is frequently understood in the Greek Orthodox Church as one of the apostles. Why? Because she, with Paul, preached the gospel. Okay, I mean, this story is doing really wild things with the stereotypes, gender stereotypes of the Greco-Roman world. There's also a backlash, too, in the Pauline tradition. This is 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy is probably written about the same time as the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Somewhere, it's not written by Paul. It's written somewhere in the mid-2nd century. Women should dress themselves modestly and decently in suitable clothing. That is, not dress like men and cut your hair. Okay, that's exactly what he's saying. Not with their hair braided or with gold pearls or expensive clothes, but with good works, as is proper for women who profess reverence for God. Let a woman learn silence with full submission. Completely unlike the Pauline text, where women are prophesying and preaching, and Thecla's out there. You see? So within this tradition of the Pauline groups, you got one reaction one way, and it got another reaction going the other way. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. The fact that you have to say that, it's happening. Okay. You only make laws when things happen. If nothing happens, you don't get a law. For Adam was formed first, and then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived. This is where we get this whole weird interpretation of Genesis, that it's the woman's fault. Right? I mean, it's not in the story. People should actually read the story. But the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith, love, holiness, and modesty. So this is a reaction. See? Thecla's not out there bearing children. See? She's not dressing modestly. She's preaching. She's in an all-female community, see, that pays allegiance to Paul. And this guy says, no, now wait a minute, we don't want to do that. Okay, that's not going to happen. Okay, the interesting thing is, 1 Timothy gets in the canon in the 4th century, becomes part of the canonical text, but Thecla remains very, very popular until the 12th century. Then it just kind of dies out, especially in the West. In the East, it's still popular. Why? The East has married clergy. So they play this, they bend the gender a little differently. See, we didn't get married clergy in the West until the Protestant Reformation. So, okay. Chosen families. This is another big characteristic. You have to make a distinction between natural families and fictive families. Okay, a natural family is a blood family. A fictive family is a family that has all the characteristics of a natural family except it's not natural. It's a family you choose to put together. Okay, and people have done this forever. Okay, I used to have aunts who weren't aunts. You know, when I grew up in Kentucky, you know, these big farm families, and there were a number of women who just for one reason or another never got married. Today they'd probably be lesbians, but in those days they just, you know, and they became your aunt. You know, they were part of your family. That family construction is fictive. And fictive doesn't mean unreal. It's just that the relations are fictive. Okay? You have to distinguish between a nuclear family and extended. The ancient world does not know about nuclear families. They assume all families are extended. And there you see Augustus's extended family. Okay? That's all of his family up there on top. And we saw this image, you know, where you see the family is always extended. It always includes lots of folks. Chosen families also, you find one of the most common usages among these groups is brothers and sisters. And in fact, in a lot of groups, it's brothers only. If we have any Spanish speakers, for example, in Spanish, it's also true in French. If there's 10 women in a room and one man, it's a he. Everything goes masculine. Same thing happens in Greek. So a lot of these early Jesus groups, they refer to everybody, men and women, as brothers. And that's part of this gender mixing kind of thing that goes on. Okay? The Father, a major understanding of God from among these groups is God as Father. Look in the Old Testament sometime, you will only find God as Father mentioned twice. It's not a major theme in Hebrew literature. It becomes one of the major themes in the early Jesus groups. One of the major ways of talking about God as Father. It's part of this family notion. So you have a new father, and therefore the male doesn't have to be father in quite the same way. It can then look quite a bit different, especially if God is by gender. Okay? So it starts to play with how you put all that stuff together. And they gather around house churches. It might be better to translate them home churches. You know, because and some of these fictive families, they all live together. We know that some groups share property and goods. So it's a kind of a reconstruction of society. It's a kind of an alternate society in many ways. Now this is the Markan passage, just not from Jesus, but it represents this kind of problem that many people, in order to join this group, had to break with their family. That was a common kind of experience. Okay, that they would, in order to join the group, they would end up breaking with their family. And here you get Jesus on record that it's okay, that his real family is not. This, by the way, drives the Catholic Church nuts. You know, with the Virgin Mary and the Holy Family and all. They all want to, because he pushes them off on the side. Okay. Here's the Acts of Perpetua and Felicia. It's 200, somewhere like that. It's a Latin text. And And it starts off, its very first paragraph is about her having a fight with her father. While we were still under arrest, she said, my father, out of love for me, was trying to persuade me to shake my resolution. Father, said I, do you see this vase here, for example, or water pot or whatever? Yes, I do, she said. And I told him, could it be called by any other name than what it is? And he said, no. Well, so I too cannot be called anything other than what I am, an adherent of Christus, Christianos in the Latin text. At this my father was so angered by the word adherent of Christus that he moved towards me as though he would pluck out my eyes. A pretty violent reaction. Okay, now this is a fiction. I mean, this is a romance tale. It belongs to that kind of genre. But he left it at that and departed, vanquished, along with his diabolical arguments. And that tells you her comments about her father. She thinks he's diabolical, that he's identified with the demons. Okay? So this problem with families is not only in the early period, it's still a wide open issue in the 3rd century. It's still going strong. So that's why you get the recreation of other families. Many of them lose a natural family and have to recreate a new family. Okay? It ties into another thing. Primary form of, you got all these young women and stuff like that. Birth control is a real issue in the ancient world, but they don't have a lot of good methods. And abortion, one of the reasons you don't get much discussion about abortion in the ancient world is it's too dangerous. So the preferred method of child control is exposure, where the baby that's not wanted is exposed. That's why almost all these cultures think that the child does not become a human until about the 2nd year. There's too many kids dying, and too many babies being exposed to get highly invested in it. So they tend to put win his life, they put it off until it's got a good chance of living, and it's something you want to keep. I'm not trying to be crass, but we know this. It's just the way it worked. Okay? Early Jesus groups, especially these groups that were all women, they collected the babies who had been exposed. And most of the babies that were exposed were women. Okay? So guess what? They get even more women. Okay? Now, in the 3rd and 4th century, we get these conversion stories, all of which are of a pagan man marrying a Christian woman. Because you get this situation in which upper-class pagan families are exposing the female babies. Okay? And then they don't have anybody to marry. And the Christians are over here with all these women and not enough men. So guess what happens? You don't have to be very imaginative here. It just happens. And so you get all these conversion stories of a male becomes a Christian when he marries a woman. We have lots of these stories. We have very few stories of women converting. We have some, but not many. Family breakup. This is from Paul. We have no teaching from the Lord addressed to those in other situations, but my advice is that if a member of the community has a wife who is not a member of the anointed's community, and she is willing to live with him, he should not leave her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a member of the community, and he is willing to live with her, she should not leave her husband. Now notice again, we saw this same thing when he was talking about sexual relations. He does things mutually. What's true of one is true of the other. Doesn't draw distinctions here. Because the husband who is not a member is consecrated through his wife, and the wife who is not a member is consecrated through her husband. Paul seems to understand. What you don't ever get in Paul is any idea that you should try to convert the other person. From Paul's point of view, they're already sanctified. Being married to one who is in the anointed is enough if they live with them in peace, they are sanctified. Why? Because Paul's Jewish understanding of sex is the two become one. See? This gender bending plays out in really kind of odd ways. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, and it is obvious that they belong to God. So Paul says, if the other non-believing party is not sanctified, would not your offspring be unclean? And he says, obviously they're not. They're good. See? And it's an empirical argument. He's not making a theological argument. He's not talking about souls or anything like that. He says, you love your kids and they're wonderful, right? So they're not unclean. You're not going to say that. By the way, therefore, I forget where disciples are on this topic. There's no infant baptism in these groups. See, because they haven't found out about original sin. That's Augustine, in the late 4th century. God has... Okay. But if the partner who is not a member of the community insists upon it, a divorce should be granted. The brother or sister who is not bound in such cases. God has called us to live in peace. Again, notice this peace topic, which is really important to these folks. After all, wife, what do you really know about whether you will save your husband, or what do you really know, husband, about whether you will save your wife? So he lets it up. He's really pretty about it. Israel. This is a really difficult problem to deal with conceptually because of the way we have all been raised as Christians to understand we're not Jewish. Okay? I mean, one of the fundamental things about being a Christian is you're not Jewish. And there is an inherent anti-Semitism in that. It's been a long, long problem which still sticks with us in odd sorts of ways. Most of this separation between Judaism and Christianity goes back to Constantine. He's the real pusher on this one. It happens with creed and Trinity. Once Trinity gets established, Judaism assumes that Christianity is polytheistic. And they got a good argument. It's a difficult one to think your way out of. Okay? Judaism never had a creed. You don't have to believe anything to be a Jew. You just have to be a Jew. Okay? It's a religion of praxis. It's what you do, not a religion of belief. The sun calendar. One of the things that Constantine did was he switched the Christianity from being on a moon calendar, which is Jewish. That's why we have these debates about when Passover and Easter are. Okay, because one's on a moon calendar, one's on a sun calendar. And he moved the Christian church to a sun calendar. And he also thought he was the sun god. This is a denarius from the period. I actually own this coin. It's in my collection. This is Constantine on this side, and there he is as the sun god. So even though he was a Christian, he still thought he was divine. He was an emperor. You don't just wipe that away. That still kind of stays in the mix here. Okay? So Israel, Jesus is proclaimed by his followers as the Jewish Messiah, the Anointed. That's fundamental to what these groups are about. Okay. It's the God of Israel that they worship. They don't worship God in general. They worship the God of Israel. It's the God of Israel who made promises, who makes a covenant. It's not just Aristotle's God. It's a very particular God. The holy writings of this group are the writings of Israel. There's no Old Testament. Okay? That comes after Constantine. And no Jew would think of it as an Old Testament. Just think about it. The very term Old Testament is inherently anti-Semitic. Rome sees them as a Jewish sect We saw this last week when we looked at Pliny and Trajan's letter. He understands these as a Jewish, some kind of weird Jewish group. And what we tend to see in the New Testament as anti-Judaism is in fact debates going on within Judaism. It's not from the outside arguing, it's from the inside arguing who's got the best. Okay? And frequently the debate is who's the true Israel. Well, here's the famous passage, the woe to the Pharisees. When we read this passage traditionally, the Pharisees represent all of Judaism and they're all being condemned, right? No, he doesn't like Pharisees. He thinks his group is the right group. Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, again, this is not a Jesus saying, this is created by Matthew. The scholars and Pharisees occupy the chair of Moses. That is a really important thing to notice. He still thinks they are the true teachers. So he's not breaking with Judaism in any way at all. So do everything they tell you, but don't do what they do. They don't practice what they preach. They invent heavy burdens and lay them on folks' shoulders. But they themselves won't lift a finger to move them. Everything they do for show. So when they widen their phylacteries and enlarge their tassels, they love the best couches at banquets and the prominent seats in synagogues and respectful greetings in marketplaces, having everyone call them Rabbi. Okay? But none of you shall be called Rabbi. Again, notice the leveling feature. After all, you have only one teacher, and all of you belong to the same family. Same family. See? These themes just keep coming up. And don't call anyone on earth Father, since you have only one Father, and He is in heaven. You are not all to be called instructors, because you have only one instructor, the Anointed One. And now whoever is greater than you will be your slave. Notice this kind of inversion theme. And those who promote themselves will be demoted, and those who demote themselves will be promoted. You scholars and Pharisees, you impostors, damn you. You slam the door of the empire of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves don't go in, and you block the way of those trying to go in. So this is an intra-Jewish argument. This is an intra-Israel argument. It's not from the outside to Judaism. It's not arguing from a Christian point of view at all. Now, how large were these groups? We think, based on actually minimal evidence, that the average home church was no more than 10 to 20 people. So you don't think about anything like Harvard Avenue. Nobody in the first 2 centuries ever had this many Christians, or there weren't any, in the same room, or followers of Jesus. That just didn't happen. It's just not enough. Paul talks about, when you read this letter, gather everybody in the community into one space to hear it. We know how big the rooms were in Corinth. Corinth is a well-excavated site, and it was pretty well preserved. There's nothing like this in Corinth. They're very small. So you're talking 10, 15 people. So how many people did Paul convert in his 3 years in Corinth? 10 or 15 people. We estimate that by 100 there were 7,000 Christians. And that by 180 there were about 150,000. So, Rodney Stark is the person who's done these numbers, and it's an interesting calculation. He just starts with 12 and says, okay, he looks at 4 modern church groups that are growing and says, what's the average rate of growth? And it's 5% a year. The Mormons have been growing at 5% a year for a long time. And they're one of the chief growing groups. So you multiply 12 by 5 per annum, and that's the numbers you get. Okay, so it's, at some level I think it's a little hokey. On the other hand, I think it's probably about right. We don't get artifacts until about 180. That's why that number is significant. That's when things start to turn up that we can identify as belonging to this group. And archaeologists will tell you that it takes about 150,000 people in a culture before they make stuff that's distinctive. Otherwise, you tend to blend in. It takes you a while to disassociate from the group. So the numbers are probably reasonably accurate. Family is seen as one of their primary ways of organizing themselves. And there's a lot of stuff going on around families. Schools, they are big on schools. Now, not schools in the modern sense, schools in the ancient sense, which is more like we would call book clubs or discussion groups. It's not formal schooling like we go on. That's actually fairly rare in the ancient world. So you have teachers, students. Students is one of the titles that they refer to each other in the group. Brother, sister, students, or disciples. You should all be students and forget the disciples bit. Heresis, which becomes the word heresy, in the 2nd century just means schools. So it's in the 3rd century that it takes on this negative tone. Why? One of the functions of schools is to generate new ideas. When they generated so many, they decided there were too many of them. And so they started to try to shut it down, and the word then takes on a negative tone. It becomes understood as a negative word. Associations, this is a big one. Ecclesia, commonly translated as church, gathering would be a good name for it, calling out. Synagogue, the synagogue, both of these are what the Greeks would call an association. Okay? So associations are involved mutual support. That's primary to an association. And you have rules about the mutual support. Some of them are associations based on funerals. You want to have your death paid for. Some of them are child rearing. There's a whole bunch, all these different kinds of groups get formed in the ancient world around associations. The chief characteristic of Jesus groups as associations is common meals. Now, they're common meals and not Eucharist because they don't view it as a sacrament, and it doesn't happen on Sunday. It happens whenever. Okay? So there's no Sunday celebration going on here. That has not really happened yet in this early period. The common meals are really important. This is a fresco from Herculaneum, and it shows the way you eat in a Roman world. So they recline on couches, all right? And tables are always small little things you put the food on. Okay, they don't have any big tables in the ancient world. There are no tables in libraries in the ancient world. There are no books either, by the way. Only scrolls, which are rather difficult to read. This we're going to come back to. See the garbage on the floor? Okay. Notice here's the wine pot, and here's one that's being filled up over here. This is a baker. So you didn't bake bread, except in villages. Villages you might bake your bread, but in the city you buy bread in the ancient world. We actually have a loaf. That's from Pompeii, and it got carbonized and survived. So you actually see what an ancient loaf of bread looks like. It's flat, what we would call flat bread. This is not leavened bread. Okay, it's flat bread for the most part. Pita. And there are a lot of these mosaics around the ancient world of the garbage on the floor. So since there was garbage on the floor, just put it in a mosaic and then it'll all match in. It just won't look so bad. All right? Oh, one of the things about the common meal tradition I think is really important. This is the one thing that we know is characteristic of all Jesus groups in the first 2 centuries. It goes away by the mid-3rd century. In the mid-3rd century, the groups get too large, and they move out of home churches and into church buildings, and it moves to an altar. And once you move to an altar, then the whole thing becomes a completely different. That's when you get Eucharist and that kind of thing. Persisting oral traditions. There's no New Testament, remember, in the first 2 centuries. That only comes in the 4th. Writings that make up the New Testament are being written in this period, but they don't think they're New Testament by any means. The writings are, in fact, Jewish writings, what we would call the Old Testament. That's what when they say holy writings, that's what they mean. There's a lot of preaching, but not sermons. Preaching is more, in the ancient world, a dialogue, a back and forth. If you go to a black church, you can see how it works. You know, that's the kind of thing that's going on. And storytelling. That's why we get the Acts of Perpetua and Thecla and all these kind of stories. They love storytelling. And so that becomes a major way of communicating among themselves. So the chief characteristics: resistance to the empire, fictive families, often headed by women, okay? Common meals, mutual care. This is a biggie. You know, that comes with the association and with the common meals is the care for each other. And we know that a lot of these groups held goods in common. That's it. I'm sorry, I got carried away. So
Thank you, Brandon, for being with us. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
2 weeks. Brandon's always a very, very interesting speaker and takes us to another level. Would you agree? Yeah. So, thank you.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate it. Please remember to sign up over here. Of course, last day for the Christmas party, sign up with a check. And then also the breakfast on December 19th, please sign up. And the teams. Services one more Sunday as well. So again, thank you very much, Brandon. We appreciate it. Have a great week, everyone.